Hey everyone, today we're going to be building our very own chatbot assistant using the OpenAI API. We're going to build this with a NestJS backend and a Next.js UI, which is a very modern, performant stack and my preferred way to create full stack applications today. We're going to see how to get up and running with this setup and build this cool chatting application that we can send messages to the OpenAI API and actually have a conversation with it to get back any response. Now this is going to be completely free with a free credit from OpenAI. Let's go ahead and get started to see how we can build this application and learn a lot in the process. I'll see you there. So before we jump in, I just wanted to let you know if you enjoy this video on Next.js and NestJS, building a full stack production grade application, and you'd like to see more on this particular setup and how to implement things like authentication, WebSockets, Stripe payment gateways, and more, you can go ahead and check out my latest course on building a shopping app with Next.js, NestJS, and Prisma. It's currently in development with over 6 hours of content and more coming along. I'll leave a link below for you to check it out if you'd like to learn more about this excellent stack that I recommend for everyone when building full stack applications today. All right, let's go ahead and jump right into the video and I'll see you there. All right, so our first step is of course going to be setting up an account with OpenAI so we can get access to the underlying API that's going to power our chatbot. So you can sign up for a free OpenAI account at openai.com. And here you'll be able to sign up for an account and get a free $5 credit, which is going to let us get started with creating this chatbot all for free at no cost to you. So let's go ahead and make sure you create an account by going to Products API Login, click API, and now I've been logged in to my account. So you're going to need to go ahead and create an account and then you'll be able to access your dashboard. Now, once you've created an account, you'll be brought to your dashboard here. Now, like I said, we're going to get $5 in free credits to go ahead and get started. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. We're going to utilize these credits. Now, we're going to have to go to the API keys tab now to provision a new API key to use later on in our application so we can access the underlying API. So go ahead and click on API keys, and now you'll be brought to the page where we can provision new API keys. So click on create new secret key, and we'll leave all of the defaults selected here. I'm just using this default project, and for the name, I'll just say this is for our NestJS project. So go ahead and click create secret key. And importantly, we need to now copy this secret key here immediately because we won't be able to access it again later on. So make sure you copy this secret key and keep it somewhere secure where you will not lose it so we can use it later on. But of course, you don't want to reveal this secret key to the internet or anyone else, as this is going to allow you to authenticate requests to OpenAI, so it needs to be kept secure. So in my case, I'll just open up another tab and simply paste in my secret key for now until we utilize it later on in our Nest.js backend. So now we have the secret key, we have everything we need to actually start making calls to the OpenAI API and create this chatbot. Let's go ahead and get started creating it by opening up a terminal where we're going to use the Nest CLI to create our Nest.js backend. So if you don't have the Nest CLI, you can run npm install global at nestjs/CLI, and I'll grab the latest version. All right, so with the Nest CLI installed, we can use it now to generate a new project using Nest new, and I'll call this Nest.js OpenAI. We can go ahead and use whatever package manager you'd like. I'll use pnpm, and we'll go ahead and install the dependencies we'll need for the project. All right, so let's cd into Nest.js OpenAI, and we'll go ahead and open up this project in a code editor now. So now we're inside of our Nest.js backend, and we can see we have all of the default files here we'd expect from a new Nest project. We have the main TS where we're bootstrapping our server and creating the application. We're also then listening on port 3000 for incoming HTTP requests. We know we have our single route here defined in our app controller, which is exposing one get route right now. That's simply returning the app service get hello, a stub string. We're wiring all of these together in our app module, and that means we can now start up this application and make sure it works as expected. Let's go ahead and do that by running the start command. So for NestJS, we know this is start dev to start up the server in development mode. So this will start up the server. You can go ahead and open up Postman to make sure that everything is working properly. So I'll go ahead and now launch a request at localhost 3000, which is where our server should be running. So send this off, and we get our status 200 with the hello world response back. So our NestJS backend is running okay. Now we're ready to start adding our OpenAI functionality into it. So let's start off by firstly adding a .m file in the root of our application where we're going to provide the environment variables our app needs. So this is where we're going to now copy over our secret key that we created earlier. So I'll go ahead and copy the secret key and add it into our .m file now. So this .m file is going to be loaded in to our project using the .m library, which we're going to configure later on. Now, by default, NestJS is already git ignoring any .m files, so this is excellent. This is just what we want. We never want to be committing environment variable files because they will contain sensitive information like our OpenAI API key, which is the new environment variable we're going to call this. So go ahead and create this environment variable and set the key here. And now at this point, we're ready to install the dependencies we're going to need in this application to run everything. So as I just mentioned, we're going to need the .m package to actually read in that .m file into our Node application. So let's npm install NestJS config. So this is the wrapper around the .m library that NestJS offers. Then we only need to add the OpenAI Node.js package. So this is an npm library from OpenAI that allows us to easily interact with the OpenAI API. So go ahead and install these two dependencies. So this is everything we're going to need. Let's go ahead and start up our server once again. And now I want to go ahead and set up that NestJS config package that we just installed. So to do this, we'll go into our app module. And now to initialize this config dependency, NestJS/config library exports a NestJS module called the config module, which we simply initialize in our imports array here. So let's go ahead and use the config module. We'll import config module from NestJS/config. So this is a NestJS module, so we simply call for root on it to initialize it with any options that we'd like. We'll use the default options, which point at this .m file at the root to load in any of these environment variables. So now our application will have access to the OpenAI secret key. I'll go ahead and remove all of these default app files. So the app controller, we're not going to actually utilize this. Same as the app service. Let's remove it and then update our app module to no longer reference these files. Now at this point, I want to create a new module for all OpenAI functionality, so we keep this nice and modularized in our application. Let's go ahead and open up a terminal to go ahead and create this new module. So I'll run nest generate, so we'll use the nest CLI again to help us, module OpenAI. So this automatically creates an OpenAI folder inside with the empty OpenAI module. Now let's go ahead and generate a controller and service for this module as well so that we can receive HTTP traffic and actually abstract our business functionality into a service. So I'll go ahead and generate the controller and now the service. So you can see here, this also automatically updates the OpenAI module, set the OpenAI service as a provider and the controller as a controller here. And finally, we can see in our app module, we've also imported the OpenAI module now as well, so our Nest app knows about it. Let's go back to our OpenAI controller where we can now define the route we're going to need to expose chat functionality. Now notice this API has already been prefixed with this OpenAI string, so that's great. That means we'll have to access this controller at /OpenAI. Let's go ahead and create a new post route. So to do this, we use the add post decorator. And the functionality we're going to utilize in OpenAI is that of a chat completion. So chat completions allow us to continue a given chat. So you provide OpenAI with the current history or state of the chat, and then it returns back to you the latest chat, known as a chat completion. So we're going to go ahead and decorate this route with chat completion so that it's going to be at /OpenAI/chat completion. And then I'll go ahead and create the function create chat completion. So now I want to go ahead and define the body. So the HTTP request, we're going to be sending a body, which again, as I said, is going to contain the current state of the chat so that OpenAI knows how to respond given all of the existing chats. It can actually change its response based on the history, which makes it super powerful and useful as a chatbot. So we want to go ahead and extract that incoming body. We know we can do this with the add body decorator. So this is going to be called body. And now I want to define a type for this so that we can also apply validation, which is always important to do in any API we build to ensure that the input we're getting is expected. So to do this, I'll go ahead and create a new DTO folder inside of OpenAI. So this will stand for Data Transfer Object. And we'll define a new create chat completion .request. So this is going to go ahead and export a class where we have the create chat completion request. So in here, I want to go ahead and define the incoming payload that the user will be sending. So as I mentioned before, we're going to be sending all of the existing messages in the chat. So let's define a messages property. And now I want to create a separate type for this array. So let's also export a chat completion message DTO here. And inside, we're going to have two properties that the chat completion API expects. So that's going to be, firstly, the role of type string. And this is going to define for this given message, who is the one that sent it? Is it the user or is it the system, meaning actually OpenAI? So we have the role we're going to provide, and then we have the underlying content, which is the actual message itself. So this is going to be of type string. Now we can reference this type here as a chat completion message DTO array. So now we've correctly defined our request here, which describes the shape of our data. Let's go ahead and reference it now inside of the OpenAI controller. I'll have the create chat completion request. So this is great. We have the body. However, as I specified before, we also want to provide validation to this incoming request so that we know that the body we get here actually corresponds to this class. So to perform validation, we're going to make use of the class validator library that NestJS offers to make it super easy to perform validation on our APIs. Let's go ahead and do that next. So to apply validation, we're going to utilize class validator. So let's open up a terminal to install class validator. This is what we're going to use to validate our incoming requests. And we also need class transformer. So now that we have these dependencies, let's firstly go into our main.ts, which we need to go into to actually set up validation using class validator. So we're going to apply a pipe to our application for all routes. We're going to call app.useGlobal pipes, and now supply new validation pipe from NestJS common. So this is going to run all of our requests through this pipe, and a pipe allows us to transform an incoming request, or in this case, apply some validation to it. I'm also going to supply an options object and set whitelist to true. So whitelist is another great property to set. It actually strips any properties on the incoming request body that we did not define. So this again just ensures that the object we're going to receive on our HTTP route will be the exact object we're expecting. So with this in place, we can now actually go back to our DTO, and since we're using the @body decorator, NestJS will automatically run our class validator pipe, and that means we can simply apply some decorators to this incoming request type that we defined on the @body here. We define the create chat completion request. So we can define decorators on here from class validator, which define the actual validations we want to apply. So let's go ahead and get started. Firstly, we'll apply validation to this underlying message DTO. So the role here will say is a string using the isString decorator, and we need to manually import this now. Import isString from class validator. So now we know this property is a string. We also want to use isNotEmpty, which will make sure it's not an empty string. Let's go ahead and define both of these decorators for the content as well. So now we know both of these properties are strings that are not empty. Finally, we need to actually supply the messages property here with validator so that we apply the validation on this custom type here that we're using. So we simply go ahead and firstly say that this is an array with isArray to make sure that the value passed is an array. And then to validate the underlying messages in the array, according to this schema here, we need to use the validate nested decorator and also supply an options object where we set each to true. So that's going to apply the validation for each object in this messages array. Finally, we need to utilize class transformer to actually turn this into the correct type. Since it's not a primitive type in JavaScript, we need to explicitly turn this into the chat completion message DTO type, which we can do by simply returning the type as a value here in this callback to the type decorator. So now our request is properly decorated. That means we're going to apply validation to all incoming requests. We know that the body we now have in this function is going to be the exact type thanks to class validator. Let's go ahead and now start implementing the functionality to actually send our request to OpenAI. So now in the OpenAI service, I want to get access to the underlying OpenAI SDK, which is going to come from the OpenAI library that we installed earlier. Now I want to actually provide this SDK as a singleton in our NestJS application as a provider that we can inject inside of our OpenAI service. So let's go ahead and do this by going back to the OpenAI module. Now in here, we can go ahead and in the providers array, let's go ahead and define a custom provider that's going to be the instance of OpenAI that our application will use as the singleton. So I'll open up a new object here as the provider, and we can set the provider injection token now. So this is going to be how other classes reference this provider. In our case, we can actually use the OpenAI import itself, this token here, from OpenAI, and this is going to ensure whenever we utilize this in our injectable dependencies, it's going to use the provider that we specify here. So now we're defining the injection token. We now want to define the instance of OpenAI. So to do this, we can use the use factory to actually declare a provider asynchronously that allows us to inject other dependencies we need to create this provider. So in our case, that's going to be the config service that we want to use to actually read the .env at our project's root to get access to our OpenAI API key. So in the use factory, we can provide a callback function that gets given any providers that we'll go ahead and later inject into this function. So in our case, that needs to be the config service of type config service from NestJS config. So we imported the config module earlier, and this module exports a config service provider that allows us to easily get values from the .env. So we can go ahead and use this now to return the underlying new OpenAI instance here, which I want to be the singleton throughout our app, meaning it's only created once and shared between all usages. Now for the actual options object, we can supply the API key to this OpenAI SDK instance, which will then use it to authenticate all subsequent requests. So now we can simply utilize the config service by calling .get or throw. So this is going to pull off the .env property or throw an error if it does not exist. So now we can pull off the OpenAI API key. So now we've instantiated this OpenAI class correctly. That's going to be used as our NestJS provider. We finally need to go ahead and set the inject array. So this is how we actually tell NestJS which dependencies to inject here. We say we want to inject the config service type from NestJS config. We'll also have to go ahead and now import the config module as well into the OpenAI module so we have access to it. So now at this point, we can see that our application is still working correctly and we're providing this OpenAI provider. We can finally utilize it now in the OpenAI service to easily make calls to the OpenAI API. So now to do that, we'll inject this OpenAI provider that we just created by creating a new constructor and injecting the private read-only OpenAI instance. And we know the injection token type here is, of course, this OpenAI import from OpenAI. This is the same that we provided in the OpenAI module here as the provider injection token. All right, so now that we have this SDK available, let's go ahead and now finally create a new async function called createChatCompletion. So this is going to get passed in the messages array from the incoming request, which we know is of type chat completion message DTO, or type array. So now that we have the messages that we're going to pass to OpenAI to get a response from, we can return this.openai. So OpenAI SDK, we can see all of the available properties on it here and all the functionality it exposes, which includes a lot of different APIs. So you can utilize these as you need to build your application. In our case, we want to take advantage of the chat API. So we're going to use .chat and then the .completions API called .create. So this is going to create a new chat completion given an existing history of messages. So pass messages, and we have to explicitly cast this type as chat completion message param array. Lastly, we're going to supply the model of OpenAI that we're going to be using. In my case, I'm going to use GPT-4. And these models vary in their use cases as well as pricing. You can read more on the OpenAI documentation, which I'll leave a link to below. So this is all we need to do to return back the OpenAI response given this list of messages. We've already authenticated to it given our API key thanks to NestJS config. So lastly, we need to go back to the OpenAI controller and now call this service method. So I'll go ahead and inject in the constructor the private read-only API OpenAI service of type OpenAI service. And now we can reference it in our createChatCompletion function. So let's go ahead and return this.OpenAI service.createChatCompletion. And now we'll pass in the body.messages array. So now at this point, our API is ready to accept a createChatCompletion request and return the response from OpenAI. So I'm going to go ahead and now launch a post request at our server localhost 3000 /OpenAI/chat completion. So this corresponds to our prefix and the name of the route. Let's go ahead and send a JSON body. So click on body, raw, JSON selected. And now if we send an empty JSON body, you can see we firstly get an error. Messages must be an array, 400 bad request. So just as we'd expect. Thanks to class validator validating our incoming request. So let's go ahead and define this messages array now. Inside we'll have a single message. So I'll send this off. And now you can see that our class validator is specifying the role and content need to be provided. So let's do that. We'll provide the role. So in our case, the role should be of type user since we're the user type. And then for content, we'll go ahead and supply a random message saying hello. And now we'll go ahead and send this request off. And now we can see we're getting this response chat completion back with a choices array. And inside we have the actual response from OpenAI. Hello, how can I assist you today? Which is excellent to see. We can also see the role type here has changed to assistant to specify it's not the user. And now we can send a more complex query as well. Now keep in mind, each of these requests will dip into your free credits that you have available on the OpenAI API server. So just keep that in mind. This also depends on how complex your query to the OpenAI server actually is. And you can actually see this down below in this usage property. It will tell you how many tokens your API request took. So we have 167 here. However, if we look at the first request I sent, which simply asks hello, which is going to be a very simple query, my tokens just come back as 18. So our API is working as expected, which is great. Let's go ahead and now create a simple UI to actually allow for this communication to our OpenAI backend. All right, so we're going to use Next.js to create our UI. So I'll use npx create next app at latest to create a new Next.js app. I'll go ahead and call this Next.js OpenAI, and then we'll go ahead and use all the defaults here. So we'll use TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind. We'll also use Daisy UI on top of Tailwind to give us some really nice styling with less boilerplate. So we'll use no source directory, app router, no import alias. And now let's go ahead and wait for these dependencies to all install. So with this set up, I'll go ahead and back in my code editor, I'll actually go ahead and simply add this new project to our existing workspace. So I'm using VS Code. I can go into File, Add Folder to Workspace, and I'll simply click on the new Next.js OpenAI application and click Add. So now we have both of our projects in our code editor here. You can also save this workspace to make sure you don't lose it. So now back in our terminal, I can cd into our UI, so Next.js OpenAI, and to start our server up, we can npm run dev, which is starting up the development server. Now you can see here that the default port for Next.js is actually conflicting. So by default, it uses port 3000. Let's simply go back to our NestJS server. So in the main TS, let's listen on port 3001 instead and allow Next.js to use the default. So now we'll go ahead and restart our NestJS server firstly. And let's start up the Next.js server now at port 3000. So now our development server is started up. Let's open up this URL. So now we can see our Next.js application's starter template, which means our server is running successfully. This is great. Let's go back to VS Code. So we have the default Next.js application here with the app router approach, which is the latest approach. And we have everything configured to start building our chatting application. There's going to be a few other dependencies that we're going to utilize. So go ahead and open up a terminal in your UI so we can grab the dependencies we'll need. We'll go ahead and npm install at tailwind css/topography, as well as Daisy UI. So Daisy UI is a set of helper CSS classes built on top of Tailwind to give us some really nice looking components. And Tailwind itself is a CSS library that allows us to style our React components based off of predefined classes. So these will both be development dependencies. So I'll use -d and go ahead and install these. The Tailwind topography is just going to be some nicer looking topography. So now we can go back to our tailwind.config.ts. Now let's go ahead and configure Tailwind. So firstly, our plugins. We're going to go ahead and require at Tailwind CSS/topography, and then go ahead and also require as a second import Daisy UI. So this is going to go ahead and load both of these plugins into Tailwind. And then we can further configure Daisy UI by applying a Daisy UI property here, and go ahead and now configure the themes array where I now want to utilize a dark theme. So we can even see back in our terminal that Daisy UI has been loaded into our application, and we have this theme added. That's the dark theme by default. So at this point, we're ready to now go into our page.tsx where we're rendering our existing home component. And what I want to do to start off is just get rid of all of this boilerplate JSX that Next.js introduces. So go ahead and simply return an empty JSX expression for now, and we can remove the import to the image. Now, of course, if we go back, we can see we have an empty screen with this nice background applied thanks to the Daisy UI dark theme. Let's go ahead and now use Tailwind and Daisy UI to build a nice chat window we can use to send and receive messages to our OpenAI backend. So head back into our home component, and let's now open up some parentheses and wrap everything inside of a new div element where I want to give a class name and now apply some Tailwind classes. So this root div, I want to center this div on the screen. So I'm going to make it take up the height of the screen. We're going to make it flex, so flex box, and I want to align everything in the center, all the children. So we're going to use item center for flex, which is going to be our align content setting. And then for justified content, we want to justify center as well. So we can use Tailwind justify center here. I also want to flex column to make sure we arrange the children in a column. And now I want to give a gap of 10 to all of the elements in the flexbox column. Lastly, we're going to give this a container class to give it a max width, as well as MX auto to make sure that all of our content is automatically centered. And I'll give it padding left, padding top 6, padding right 4 to give it some spacing now as well. So now we have all of these classes defined, which is going to give our div some nice centered styling, and all of the children will now be aligned in a flexbox column, which is just what I want. I want our messages displayed in columns. So let's start off with simply providing the input field that the user is going to type messages into. So I'll have an input here of type text. I'll give it a placeholder of message to tell the user that this is the message. And then for a class name, we can utilize Daisy UI pre-built input component by simply giving it a class name of input bordered with full and margin of 10. So now at this point, we can see back in our UI, we have this really nice looking UI component thanks to Daisy UI. So now at this point, we want to maintain some state within this messages component where whenever we type into this input field, we keep track of that message so that we can then post it whenever the user, for example, hits the enter key. We want to send the message. So to do this, let's head back to our component and let's add some new state to it. Now, since we're going to be utilizing client-side state, we need to tell Next.js to render this component on the client. By default, Next.js will render all components on the server side for performance optimization. However, in our case, we need client-side interactivity here because of this form. So let's tell Next.js to make it a client component by using the useClient declaration. So now at this point, we can utilize React state and create a new piece of state to track the current message. So I'll create a const message here and a set message, which we then set equal to use state from React, and I'll provide in the empty string as the initial state. Now we can go back to our input here, and let's firstly supply the value to be the current message state, and we also want to listen to the onChange event. So we get the event, and we want to extract the message off of it and populate our message state. So we're going to call setMessage and use event target value to set the current message. Lastly, we want to listen to the onKeyDown event to listen for the enter key press. So on key down, we can get access to the event. This is going to be an async function because we're going to call our server-side OpenAI API. So we'll go ahead and open up an async callback here and firstly check to see if the event.key is equal to enter. So this is going to check to see if the user clicked on the enter key. Then and only then do we want to send this message to our server and create a chat completion with OpenAI. So next, let's create a function called handle message. And so this is going to be the async function we call from our event listener for the enter key. Whenever the user clicks it, we want to then invoke this function. So let's go ahead and now call it await handle message. So whenever we call handle message because the user clicked on the enter key, then I want to go ahead and call our backend. Now, in order to do this, we're going to move the functionality to actually call our NestJS backend on to the Next.js server side in the form of a server action. So server actions are secure server-side functions that we can call from our Next.js components that will get executed on the server. So we can use these functions to fetch data and perform any asynchronous tasks that we can accomplish on the server and keep the UI free and clear of it to keep it more performant and is also more secure, of course, being on the server side. There's a bunch of other benefits that server actions and components give us. So let's go ahead and use one. So in the app directory, we can create one. I'll create a new create chat completion.ts. So this will be an export default async function, create chat completion, and this is going to get passed in a messages array. So this is going to be the list of messages we currently have in our given chat. We also need to tell Next.js that this is a server action to be executed on the server. So just like we did for our client component, we're going to instruct it with the use server directive now. So at this point, we can now call our NestJS backend. To do this, we need to get access to our backend API URL, and I want to provide this in our Next.js app through an environment variable. So environment variables can be read in on the server, and that makes them super secure because, of course, our client won't be able to access them. Let's go ahead and create one by adding a .env.local. So Next.js will automatically read this in on the server side, and we can now provide values to the server. So let's have an API URL. So we know our Nest.js backend is listening on localhost 3001. So now we can go back to create chat completion, and let's now make a call to our backend. We'll get a const response, set it equal to await fetch, so we can use the node fetch API here, which Next.js will automatically optimize to implement caching and perform additional optimizations. Let's go ahead and provide through a template literal the process.env.api URL that we just defined. So now we want to call the /OpenAI /chat completion API to actually post this latest chat completion and get back a response. So then we can provide a request init object where we need to define the method, the HTTP method is post, and we importantly need to specify headers here. Content type needs to be application JSON so that this is sent as JSON, which our Nest.js server knows how to parse thanks to body parser middleware. Now let's go ahead and supply that body by stringifying it with json.stringify. We'll provide an object here where we pass the messages we're getting. Now we do have an error with our current definition for our message type. This is right now a string. We know that this is going to be composed of the sub-object of the message DTO, where we have the role as well as the content. So let's go ahead and define this message type inside of our UI by creating a chat completion message.interface.ts. So this, of course, will match our backend's definition of the chat completion message. We'll have the role of type string and the content of type string. So now we can utilize this back inside of our server action and now correctly type messages as an array of chat completion message. So now we're properly stringifying this and providing it as the body. The last step is to return it back to the client side with return response.json to parse the response JSON. So now we have everything we need to actually call this inside of our component. Let's go ahead and go back to our page.tsx. Now, in addition to maintaining the current message input state, we need a separate piece of state here to maintain the array of our messages. So let's go ahead and create a new const messages and set messages, which will be equal to use state. We'll pass in an empty array, and we know this will be of type chat completion message array. All right, so now in a handle message, let's go ahead and implement the functionality we need to send this to the server as well as update our client UI state. So to do this, we need to firstly set our messages array here in our state with the updated incoming message that currently exists. So to update state inside of an array in React, we do this by replacing the array entirely. We never want to mutate the array in state directly. Instead, we want to replace it. So let's go ahead and create a new const updated messages, which is going to be a new array where we'll spread all of the existing messages and then push a new message. So this message on this new array is going to have role of type user, which is the role that the user will be having as they converse with this bot. And then for the content, we of course know this is the message inside of our actual input field that we're tracking. So now we can call set messages and set the new updated messages array. And I'll also set message on our input back to the empty string. So now finally, we can actually call our NestJS backend through our server action by getting the response here. And let's await the call to create chat completion, where we need to pass in the updated messages array, which will contain all of our messages in the current chat. From here, we're going to access the .choices array that comes back from OpenAI, access the first element. If it exists, then we want to access the underlying message property, which will be the message content. So our final step is to set the messages state again. So we'll call set messages and spread the updated messages that we currently have in state, as well as the response message. So this ensures that the user immediately sees their message in our chat list. We wait for the response from the server and then reset the messages state with the incoming response, as well as everything we just had before, which includes the original message from the user. All right, so now we're handling the message properly. The last step is to actually output the messages. So let's go ahead and do this above our input. I want to add a new div. So this div, again, will utilize Tailwind and Daisy UI. I'll give it a flex box, flex column, gap 3, and I want the height to take up 75% of the user's viewport. So we can specify it like this. I want this to overflow scroll, so it will be a scrollable list of messages and then take up the full width of the container. All right, so now in this div, let's access our current messages state here that we're maintaining, and we want to map over it. So I'll get access to a message here, and for this single message, I want to return a JSX expression. This is going to include a wrapping div element. So go ahead and add a div here, and we need to give this a key, which is going to be unique for each message. Now, we're not maintaining any message state right now, so we're not going to have a unique key per message. Instead, we can just set this to the empty string for now. Now I want to give this a class name, and we need to conditionally check to see, based off of the message role, which class we're going to apply. So we need to check in here, the parameter should be message. We need to check to see if the message.role, well, if this is equal to the user, then the class name should be chat and then chat start. Otherwise, it should be chat end. So this is going to ensure that the messages we send will start at the start and the system messages will align at the end. Finally, inside of this div, I'll add one more div that has the class name of chat bubble, and we can output a paragraph tag with the message.content. So now we're correctly utilizing the message role to determine if it's a system or user message, and we're simply displaying it with nice formatting thanks to these Daisy UI component classes. All right, so now if we go back to the UI, we can see our message bar is at the bottom of the screen because our list of messages is now taking up the rest of the screen. If I send a new message here, you can see immediately, we can see it in our list, and we're getting a response back from the OpenAI assistant, which is excellent. We can go ahead and ask a more complicated question like, what is the benefit of NestJS? However, now we get all of this great information, and you can ask any question we want, As long as you still have credits available in your OpenAI account, you can continue to converse with this chatbot and ask it anything you need, which is really cool. And now we can see that our scrolling is working as expected here. So as the messages take up more room, we can see we have this nice scrolling. So thanks to Tailwind and Daisy UI, we're able to create this really nice looking chat screen very quickly and easily. And of course, this is fully responsive out of the box. I hope you've learned a lot in this video on how to interact with OpenAI and how we can utilize NestJS and Next.js to very quickly get up and running with an application. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.